Good afternoon and welcome to our first session of Uncovering Hawkeye History. I'm your host, David McCartney. I serve as the University Archivist here at the University of Iowa in the Department of Special Collections and Archives. We're located in the main library on the third floor. If you happen to be back in Iowa City, please stop by and pay a visit. I started in this role back in January of 2001. Which means I've been chronicling the university's history and materials for more than 20 years now. Those of you who read the Iowa Magazine produced by the University of Iowa Center for Advancement, you might be familiar with my column, usually on the back page, Old Gold, in which I recount tall tales of university history. I am delighted to be your host this afternoon and look forward to meeting our guests very shortly. Since 1847, the State University of Iowa, as we were originally known, has broken barriers and blazed new trails as a beacon for learning, creativity, and collaboration. Today's event is part of the university's celebration of our 175-year history, and I'm honored to be your host of this four-part series throughout the month of February, every Tuesday at this time. We've identified a mix of faculty, staff, and alumni to be featured throughout our series, with each session highlighting areas of distinction for the university, both during different points of its history as well as opportunities for future growth. So each session, beginning with today, will offer live closed captioning, and it will be recorded and shared on our YouTube channel at a future date. We encourage you to share the session with Iowa friends and family who might not be able to join us today on our live feed. Today's session, this is part one of a four-part series. Our session today is on Educating Iowa, a University of Exploration, somewhat focusing on the university's early history in the latter half of the 19th century, 1847 to 1897. Since the beginning, explorers have guided the university's progression, whether traveling to study far-off lands or searching for an inclusive campus culture. Exploration, as we all know, comes in many forms. We're joined today by three remarkable guests whom I'll introduce to you throughout the program. You can submit questions at any time for any panelist using the Q&A functionality. We are covering a lot of content today, so we may not be able to address all questions depending on the volume that we receive, but we will do our best to answer as many questions as time allows. So to get us started, I had a couple of thoughts I would like to share with you that come by way of the university archives. And the first is what I like to call the meteor story. I wrote about this in Old Gold about 5 years ago in Iowa Magazine. Some of you may know this, many of you probably don't. I certainly did not until after I began my employment here. On the very day that the University of Iowa was established by the Iowa General Assembly in Iowa City, as they were convening in the old Capitol, just a few hours later on that day, in the mid-afternoon of February 25th, 1847, a meteor struck the Earth, not too far from here in northeastern Johnson County. And I wanted to read from you, if I could, an excerpt from my column, which gives you a bit of background as to whether this event may well have been somewhat portentous or merely a coincidence. Perhaps it was an omen. Only hours after the first General Assembly of the state of Iowa voted to establish the State University of Iowa, a meteorite crashed to the ground in rural Lynn County near the Cedar River, less than 30 miles from Iowa City, the then capital of the new state of Iowa. The blast was heard throughout the countryside and it attracted considerable attention at the time. The American Journal of Science and Arts later that year in its November 1847 issue took note of this and described it as follows. An aerolite fell at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 25th day of February, 1847, within 75 yards of the house of Daniel Rogers, 9 miles due south of Marion, Iowa. The ground was covered with snow. At the time it fell, Mr. Rogers heard a loud explosion in the air and immediately ran to his door. He heard the stone and several others whiz through the air and strike the ground, and he saw the snow and dirt fly where the stone struck. The weight of the stone before it was broken was estimated to be 42 pounds. The explosion was heard distinctly by one of the surveyors who was engaged on the survey of the public lands 40 miles away from Mr. Rogers' house. Well, and that's the passage that appeared in the journal. Noteworthy as they were, the coincidence of these two events on February 25th, 1847, both, well, one legislative, the other astrophysical, went unnoticed for decades until an account appeared in 1937 in an issue of the Palimpsest, which was a publication of the State Historical Society of Iowa. But it would still be another 4 decades, nearly 4 decades, before there was even further renewed interest. In 1974, University of Iowa graduate student Mark Pessis, who is now a principal scientist at Ball Aerospace, investigated the site of the impact and identified fragments of the meteorite that had been passed on to a longtime professor of astronomy here, C.C. Wiley. Pessis' work resulted in the installation of a display of a large fragment of the old Capitol Museum in 1976, the bicentennial year of the U.S., and also a year of significant restoration of the old Capitol. And that's a display we continue to enjoy and appreciate today. So you could say that the University of Iowa started out with a bang, and things have not been quite the same in the realm of higher education since. I also would like to begin today's festivities with a quotation from the very first report issued by the State University of Iowa faculty. This was issued to the what was then known as the Board of Trustees, today, of course, the Iowa State Board of Regents. The report was submitted in 1858. This was 11 years after the university was established, but only about 3 years after the first classes were held on our campus. So this report, dated July 6, 1858, is housed in the university archives. And there's a quotation from it that I'd like to share with you all before we begin our program today. "We regard it as no small honor to have been the first laborers, the first working faculty organized in an institution in which we believe is destined at no distant day to take a high and noble stand among similar institutions in our land." That was part of the initial report of the faculty to the Board of Trustees, dated 1858. On that note, I am delighted to introduce to you now the first of our 3 guests this afternoon, a good friend and colleague who is, her office just happens to be up the hill from mine, Liz Crooks. Liz is a proud UI alumna. She received her bachelor's degree in book arts. She has served as the director of the University of Iowa's Pennacrest Museums since 2018. Before that, she held several administrative positions within the museums and across campus, including the Graduate College and the University of Iowa Center for Human Rights. Liz is joining us today to share a bit about the Pennacrest Museums, which were established in the late 19th century, and they continue to be a free resource of learning and exploration for visitors to campus. Liz, it's our pleasure to welcome you this afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us.
David, thank you for those kind words. It is indeed a pleasure to be here and to hear the story of the meteor. It's one of my favorite. It's one I'd like to reenact on February 25th. We just haven't figured out quite how to make that happen. We do have a remnant of the meteor in the old Capitol. Perhaps we pitch that out the dome and see what happens. I don't think it would be as exciting, but I can't imagine what it must have been like to be here at that time and for those two events to collide, as it were. Uh, I'm joining you from the Museum of Natural History, and that's what I have the pleasure of speaking with you about today. The Museum of Natural History was founded in 1858 in a corner of what we now know as the Old Capitol Museum Senate Chamber. It was then known as the Cabinet of Natural History, as many nascent museums of natural history were known at that time. Being founded in 1858 makes us the second oldest university west of the Mississippi. We're very proud of that. There's a Museum of Natural History in California that beat us to be the first, but that's okay. The cabinet quickly grew and moved to what was then known as Science Hall, which is found in the same spot that McBride Hall is found in today. And under the direction of Samuel Calvin, a name that may be familiar to many of you, and Thomas McBride as his assistant, another name familiar to you, expanded very quickly. Under their direction, the cabinet received funding from the state legislature. They began to collect specimens and objects of plants, animals, specifically birds and mammals, and rocks that were found within our state's border. And that formed the basis of our collection. And at that point, object-based learning really began in earnest on our campus. And as our scientific stature began to grow across the country, Charles Cleveland Nuttig, was hired as a professor and director of what was then the Museum of Natural History. That was in 1886. And let's have the first picture up and we'll take a look. Museums of that era were very different than museums as we know them today. Objects were stacked cheek to jowl, literally. You can see in that photo on our left that those objects were stacked very closely. The object there being to have as many things on display as was possible. Because this was how museums were arranged taxonomically, and this is the way that students studied them in a manner of comparison. You can see on the right that our exhibits have changed very much, and modern day museums, people have become accustomed to, while there may be a number of specimens on exhibit, they're presented in a more naturalized background to give people an understanding of the climate and environment in which those specimens may have been found. So with that new era, Calvin, McBride, and Nutting lobbied for a new building. And that building, the Natural Sciences Building, which we now know as McBride Hall, started construction in 1904. That was a really important era because not long before that, the building that housed the university library had been struck by lightning and burned to the ground. And so there was a push on campus to begin to build more fireproof buildings as they were known then. But before construction on the Natural Sciences Building could begin, uh, Old Science Hall, as it was then known, had to be moved across the street. It was rolled on logs at a rate of 10 feet a day, and classes were still held in the building while it was being moved. That must have been something else to see. It now sits across the street from us and is known, of course, as Calvin Hall and the Natural Science Building, we now know as McBride Hall, and has stood here since 1906. We can take those pictures down and maybe move on to the next. Nutting came to the University of Iowa. He had been a graduate student here, but he came to the University of Iowa after having worked for a period at the Smithsonian. And he believed very strongly in student involvement and the idea of exploration and the idea of exploration to go out, collect artifacts, and bring them back for study. We see two examples of this here. On our left is Frank Russell. This picture was taken in approximately 1892. He was about to begin his journey to the Arctic Circle, his solo journey to the Arctic Circle, which took him 2 years. At times throughout this journey, the staff and faculty back at the State University of Iowa had feared he had died because there were periods that went so long without communication from him. But happily, he returned in 1894 to a hero's welcome. He was greeted at the train station that stands on South Dubuque Street and escorted back with all the pageantry befitting such an explorer. One of the other expeditions that Nutting is most well known for is his trip to the Laysan Island. And on the right hand side of the screen, we see Professor Homer Dill, who was a professor of taxidermy and plastic arts um, in the lab with his students. And they are working on specimens that later would be incorporated into the Laysan Island cyclorama. So that's a very special photo for me because we still use that lab space today. In fact, there's a class of students in it right now, and it's right across the hall from me. So let's move on to the next picture. This is one of my favorites. It's an expedition that Nutting started in 1893. It was to travel to the Bahamas. You'll see in the students, Nutting took not only male students, but also female students. And this, this has a quote that is attributed to it that I'd like to read to you. I think it encapsulates a little bit of Nutting's spirit of adventure and the true teacher that he was. The quote is, "It is doubtful if any skipper ever started on a 3 months cruise with a more inexperienced lot of landlubbers. Everything pertaining to the sea, the vessel, and marine life was novel, and the more experienced members of the party awaited developments with no little amount of anxiety." And that's his quote from just as they were to set sail in 1893. So I like that one. Let's go to the next one. Was that the last one? Perfect. Um, I want to share with you a little bit about Nutting and his role and his philosophy. Um, he believes strongly not only in taking students, male and female, out into the field, but bringing those objects back to campus for study and not only making them available to the faculty and students on campus, but also to the surrounding community. He organized over 25 expeditions during his tenure at the University of Iowa. Some of the notable ones I've already mentioned: Russell's solo trip to the Arctic, and then the subsequent trip to Laysan Island to collect specimens. But he appreciated the importance of sharing those findings with the community at large. After almost every one of his expeditions, he would hold a public lecture, and he would also share with them glass slides that he had taken, images that he had taken during his trips, because he appreciated intuitively that these were places most Iowans would not be able to go, but they were very important and they deserved study, they deserved our care, and they deserved our concern. Uh, Most notably, I've referenced the Laysan Island expedition a couple of times, and it is probably one of his most important. Nutting studied of all things invertebrate marine life. And I often wonder, why would he come to Iowa to do that? And then I realized, oh, in February, he could go on an expedition to the Bahamas and not have to be in Iowa. So I think that maybe played into it a little bit. but he was on an expedition and his clipper ship sailed to Laysan Island, and they were collecting marine invertebrates. There were other scientists from other institutions on the ship with him. When they came across the island, it's 3 square miles, and it was filled with millions of nesting seabirds, a sight unlike which he had never seen before. And this was a well-traveled man. Well, he finished that expedition. He came back. It coincided with the building of what we now know as McBride Hall and the creation of the museum spaces within that building. And he knew he needed to reserve a space for an exhibit devoted to Laysan. These birds filled his dreams. They came to him almost every night, and he was on a mission to create this space for Iowans so that they could understand. He knew how special it was. So it took him a few years to raise money because funds were tight even back then. And he sent Homer Dill to Laysan. Dill found a vastly changed landscape. Rabbits had been introduced to the island. They had no natural predators. They had eaten almost all the vegetation. Insect life then had been obliterated, and the birds were quickly becoming endangered and extinct, the species that lived there. The seabirds left because they could, but it was the small perching birds that faced extinction. And Dill immediately knew that the focus of this expedition had changed. It was now one to capture a quickly disappearing environment. And so he collected what he could, brought it back, spent the next 3 years working with students in that lab space to create this wonderful cyclorama, and it opened to the public in 1914. It's on exhibit now. It's a treasure to me and to almost everyone who sees it. Um, it's relatively unchanged from the time when Dill installed it, which we're working on some conservation issues, and we hope to have it restored soon for future generations of Iowans to enjoy. But that just captures for me the essence of Nutting. He knew that these things were important and that it made a better museum visit. He also threw open the doors of the museum to the public and invited in not just faculty and students, but the general public, because he understood very early on that all of the things in the museum belong to the citizens of the state of Iowa. And uh, he was also an early adopter of what is known as the diorama style of display. We saw that earlier, birds on exhibit, but with a more naturalized background behind them. The cyclorama is a prime example of that kind of exhibit style. And he as an early adopter, can really be credited with changing the look of our museum, with changing the very essence of what it was we did and do and how we share that with our public. And I think about the people upon whose shoulders I stand, and there are a number to whom I'm very grateful. Former directors of this museum, Sandy Boyd, George Schrimper, Walt Teege, Homer Dill, but none more important and influential in what we do and how we study the natural world around us than Charles Nutting. So it's been an absolute delight to be able to share with you some of his story. I could go on for days. I still sit in was Charles Nutting's office. So if you're ever in Iowa City, I welcome you to stop by. We'll also be doing a more in-depth look in our upcoming exhibit, Then and Now, 175 Years on the Pentecost. So I'll put in a shameless plug for that. It opens, not coincidentally, on uh, February 25th of this month. So please join us if you can. But thank you all for the opportunity to have been here today.
Liz, thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I learned some things, especially concerning Charles Nutting's career, that I did not know about before. Liz, I'm going to keep you on the line here. We do have a couple of questions for you before we move to our,
Absolutely.
if I may. A couple of questions. Here's one I'm a bit curious about myself. You mentioned that the lab across the hall from where you're sitting is still in use today, and even as we speak, it's being used. Do students still do taxidermy there?
That is a great question. Uh, our taxidermy program, our taxidermy training program stopped when George Shrimper, former director, retired. So that would have been in the early 2000s. But I am happy to say we are reviving that program. We had a student who was very keen to learn taxidermy arts. She has a history. She's come to the museum as a student in her second career. She has a history of art and design, and she was very curious to learn how to do taxidermy. So we're starting our taxidermy program again on a limited basis. We've done an eagle. I'm sorry, we've done a red-tailed hawk, and
Appropriate.
yesterday she was here working on some rabbits. So stay tuned for more of that. But yes, it's coming back.
I'm glad to know that a hawk is among the
Absolutely.
absolutely symbolic, right?
Yeah.
That that's wonderful to know. Thank you, Liz. Couple of other questions, if I may, and this is one that I think any of us in archives or museums or libraries don't really know how to respond. So if you decline, that's certainly understandable. Do you have a favorite piece in the museum? Is there,
I do, but I can't tell you because then the other objects will know.
yeah, I understand. I understand. It's like asking a grandmother who her favorite
I
grandchild.
do have a great affection for the cyclorama because of everything that it represents, because of the parallels in conservation, both then and now. Um, the threat to the environment, it's very different now, but it's still there. The fact that the cyclorama itself is in dire need of conservation. So um, staff would tell you it's clear the cyclorama is Liz's favorite. I also have great affection for the lions because they used to live in the Iowa City Park Zoo, which I don't remember the lions, but I remember the City Park Zoo as a child. I grew up in the area, so I have great affection for them.
It's quite a connection to have also from your own youth and your own experience. Last question, I promise. Who is able to visit the museum and how much does it cost? Do you have to be a member of the university community to visit any of the museums on the Pentacrest?
Oh, I'm so grateful to whoever asked that question because I forgot my tagline is always admission is always free. We have always been a museum that is free and open to the public. We remain that way. Um, because of the pandemic, we're emerging from that and learning how to be open again. We've had to rehire our docent staff and do a lot of retraining and those sorts of things, but we're scaling back up. We're open Fridays and Saturdays from 10 to 5 p.m. We're available to university classes by appointment and as is needed, but we're open to the public on Fridays and Saturdays. So thank you for asking that.
Sure. Well, thank you to our participant who raised that question. And Liz, thank you so much again. You represent a tremendous resource on our campus and really a resource that extends to the state of Iowa and beyond. And we're really glad to, I think, fittingly start our series with your presentation. It's especially appropriate. So thank you so much again for
Thank
joining.
you, David.
We'll move on to our next guest, who is Dr. Rusty Barcelo. Dr. Barcelo is a two-time Iowa alumna. She received her master's degree in recreation education and her doctorate in education. Dr. Barcelo is a higher education change agent. I love that term. I love that uh, 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 the title or descriptor because I think it says so much about the impact that she had on our campus. Dr. Barcelo worked at the University of Iowa in various positions from 1975 to 1996, including as assistant provost and also assistant dean with the Office of the Provost. Recognized as a catalyst for change in higher education, Dr. Barcelo continues to serve as an advisor and consultant to the university's DEIA efforts. Please join me welcoming you to our panel today, Dr. Barcelo from the Southwest. It's much warmer out in your neck of the woods, I'm sure. Glad to have you with us today. And I believe you're muted, Dr. Barcelo, if you can please, there you go.
Thank you so much, David, for that kind introduction. I have to say, I'm learning a lot. I thought I knew a lot about the university, but it was really great to hear Liz and your opening comments, David. But I need to reassure you, I'm in Santa Fe, and we are expecting a major snowstorm tonight, about 6 inches, and that's a lot of snow for Iowa. But it reminds me of, for New Mexico, I should say. I'd like to locate myself in this conversation. First of all, I am not a historian. So for those of you who are historians, any issues I may raise, I apologize up front. But, I'm a Chicana. And as a Chicana, it represents my indigenous and my Spanish heritage, where they came together. When the Spaniards came, they didn't bring any women, and it resulted in a new people, the mestizos, and this is what I am. And so I think that's important, and I will tell you why in a moment. And I have always said that one of the most important things that ever happened to me was going to the University of Iowa, because primarily I was from California, and when I went to Iowa, but when I realized when I went to Iowa that I was the only Chicana, the only Chicana graduate student, I should say, I asked, why was that the case? When in fact, the state of Iowa had a large Mexican and American community throughout the state, from Fort Madison to Davenport to Muscatine, all over the state. And it was because I had discovered them because I needed to, in terms of my own nurturing that was necessary. Later on, I would meet a couple of more students from Chicago, Ruth Pushataniqua from the Meskwaki settlement, some African Americans, and we were all asking the same questions. Why were we the only ones? Why were there so few? Why wasn't the curriculum more diverse? Why weren't there more support programs in place, etc.? And then the Office of Special Support Services, which was then the diversity office, if you will, offered me an assistantship. And that changed my life forever. And it set me on a career path that I have thoroughly enjoyed for these many years, since 1969, when I first went to Iowa. And so I thank Iowa for the opportunity to grow in ways that were sometimes challenging, but also highly spirited and fruitful, etc. And so I do recognize that, and I have always acknowledged the role that Iowa played in my own career development. And it did set me on a course. But as I got involved in the work, I learned about the history. I learned that it's often been said from various platforms, whether it's a publication or a speech, and even myself has said that the University of Iowa has historically been committed to diversity. And I'm going to use diversity just in the broadest sense. I can use equity and all the other terms, but I'm just going to focus on diversity to represent underrepresented populations, if you will. And I think there's some truth to that statement when I consider that, the University of Iowa admitted women from the very beginning, when it was first established in 1847, and then, admitted them on an equal basis with men in 1860. And we were the first public university to do that. In fact, Stanford would argue with us that they were the first, but I remind them that they're a private institution. And then I think we have reason to be excited to know that in 1864, someone by the name of, or Dr. Joseph Harris earned his medical degree in the Iowa Medical College before it was even named the College of Medicine. And then again, I believe it was in 1870 that the University of Iowa had the first medical co-ed school in the country. And then again, in that same period, the University of Iowa was among the first public institutions in higher education to admit Black students. And I'm really proud of that fact, because during the 1800s, many institutions in other parts of the country were segregated, not allowing African Americans to come to their universities, which actually led to the establishment of historically Black institutions, if you will, that became an issue during the civil rights movement as they became, as demands for desegregating those institutions. And Iowa, in some ways, you might say, was ahead of that. And I think we can take great pride in knowing that in 1879, an individual by the name of Alexander Clark was our first Black law graduate. You know, he was a student at the university, and his father, interestingly enough, followed him a couple of years later to earn his law degree at the University of Iowa. I mean, this is really early on. And then, of course, given athletics, you know, in 1895, I believe Frank Kinney Holbrook, I believe was his name, was the first African-American football player. And also, most importantly, he was one of the first student athletes to actually break the color barrier in the United States. And all of these are important firsts, and I'm sure there's other firsts that I don't have time to mention. And I think we can take great pride with these firsts, given the period of time when all of this happened. But I also know these students probably were not recruited in the way that students are recruited today, and aren't necessarily welcomed. In fact, our first graduate of the law school, Alexander, often spoke about the challenges that he encountered as a Black male attending the University of Iowa and the surrounding community as well. And I'm also reminded of some that I discovered when I was sort of reviewing the history, that Richard Carlson, the architectural historian with the UI Office of the State Archaeologist's Office, he states in his own research that racism was a reality in the state of Iowa between 1847 to 1897. And I'll quote him by saying, they were not always supported by the university as they ought to have been. They were not always supported by the community at large either. And I think that this is an important fact, that while they were admitted, they were having some of these issues that sometimes echo today. And I'll tie that in a moment. And I think further evidence of the welcoming, I mean, in some ways we were admitting, but in other ways, there were things that were happening at the University of Iowa that I just learned about, that during the same time period, any student at the University of Iowa had to attend Presbyterian services. And that, of course, would discourage Jewish or other non-Christians from enrolling at the university. Fortunately, that policy was changed in the first part of the 20th century, and there was an influx then of students from the Jewish faith enrolling at the University of Iowa. But all of these things are happening, and at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that in spite of any challenges that African Americans might have experienced at Iowa, or women might have experienced at Iowa during this period, they graduated. And they went on to do some remarkable things in spite of the lack of support programs that we now enjoy today, and et cetera. But the fact is, there are still some issues that those students encountered back then that perhaps are still happening today. But I think if we look at the University of Iowa, we also need to look at the state of Iowa during the 1800s. We know historically that in the 1800s, there was a great migration from Europe to the United States, people fleeing political and religious persecution, as well as poverty and issues. And some of those individuals found their way to the state of Iowa. In fact, we're well aware that there was a Danish population that ended up in Pella. Some of the Germans ended up in what we now know as Lincoln, Iowa, or Rhinebeck, Iowa. We know that the Czechoslovakians and others from those regions settled in Cedar Rapids, etc. But at the same time, what's not known really very much is that in Buxton, Iowa, which I don't think exists anymore, it was a coal mining town. And over 50% of all the residents who worked in those mines were African American. And no doubt they went on to settle elsewhere, given that it was in southeastern Iowa. I'm guessing some of those early folks went to Des Moines and settled following the closures of the mines. And also during that same period, there was the Underground Railroad that was coming through Iowa, through places like Grinnell, Lynn County, West Liberty, if you will. And what's interesting about that while many Iowans, participated in the underground in the freeing of slaves, if you will, they also were subject to the a slavery act that would say if they were caught, they could go to prison or pay a $1,000 fine in Iowa. And I am guessing that among those who were Blacks who were fleeing the South through the Underground Railroad, I have a hunch some of them settled in Iowa. Maybe not in huge numbers, but they were there. And at the same time this was happening, the railroad was also being built, and the tracadores, or the Mexican American workers, were repairing the line, the railroad lines, and working up and down along the Mississippi River, along probably, I would guess, with Asians who played a key role in the transcontinental, railway that went through the United States, that literally connected the United States, if you will. And then I think we need to recall at this same period in the 1870s, the Sac and Fox were relocated to Oklahoma, and one line of the Sac and Fox, the Meskwaki, decided to buy some land in Tama County and establish their settlement. We're well aware of the Winnebago in Sioux City and some of the other native groups along the Missouri River. And I would argue that they were here, and too often we hear that there just haven't been minority populations in the state of Iowa. And I heard that when I was a student, quite frankly, when I started raising questions that our numbers were few and far and in between. And I would say that wasn't quite correct. They were there. I think we just didn't know about them. These populations, for the most part, were invisible. And I would also guess, over and beyond some of the more visible, if you will, the African Americans who attended the university, I would guess that others found their way to the university. And I think we need to remember that, and we should be proud of this fact, Iowa did not deny admission to any group. Unfortunately, data was not kept to know if whether or not Mexicans went to the University of Iowa. I'm often identified as the first Chicana to earn a PhD at the University of Iowa. And I always insist that they say Chicana because I was that. But I am a Mexican American. That is part of my lineage. And I would guess way back when records weren't kept, I'm sure one or two probably came through the University of Iowa. I may be wrong on that. It's just a, sort of an assumption on my part. But I think, we can make assumptions about what happened back there. But one of the things that I do know, and when Philip Jones hired me to be an assistant, I'm a graduate assistant in the Office of Special Support Service, we often talked about this history, the histories, and how it was an important foundation for our future. And even back in the 70s, we were building upon that history and how do we move to expand it. And I would argue that while things weren't perfect back then and things aren't perfect now, we have done an amazing job historically. In fact, the University of Iowa is not the same university that I went to even in 1969. Because as I look back on it, when I think about the contributions diversity has made to the University of Iowa, it is phenomenal. When I think about the curriculum is more diverse, there are more faculty of color, there are more women, and there's more leadership representing our diversity. Is it perfect? Certainly not. And there certainly are more students, and there's still more work to be done. And what I know about the civil rights movement, when we really made a positive stand and effort to really build on the past, people like, President Sandy Boyd certainly took the leadership, as Philip Hubbard and others. And we moved forward, I think, in really important ways. And we were a leader in diversity nationally. And how do I know that? Because I received the phone calls from the University of Minnesota, from the University of Wisconsin. How are you all doing this? And I think we should take really pride on it. And as we move toward the future, because of this foundation that is there, I think we need to look at this as a form of transformation that not only benefited the populations for which this work began, but it has benefited all students. And I like to think that the University of Iowa doesn't see diversity as a problem to be solved, but as an educational value with an educational outcome, because we want all of our students to work and thrive effectively in a diverse and global world. So I know my time is running short, so I'll just sort of stop and answer any questions. But thank you for this opportunity, David.
Dr. Marcelo, thank you so much for your perspective and for reminding us that we still have a long way to go in achieving true equity. but I really appreciate your perspective, and I know our participants are as well. Someone did ask about data, what data we might have on the ethnicity or the demographic makeup of our student body in the late 19th century. And I'll respond to that question by saying, unfortunately, we don't have hard data from that time. In fact, it wasn't until about 1977 that what was then known as the Office of Affirmative Action began actually gathering data on the ethnicity or racial background of students at the University of Iowa. So we don't have a lot of hard data to go on. We do know, as you said, Dr. Barcelo, that there were anecdotally there were instances of rejection or discrimination that need to be addressed, need to be remembered, but also in today's context understood that we were not alone. There were institutions that exhibited these practices in ways that would absolutely be wrong now as well as then. I would like to ask you, Dr. Barcelo, what in your 20 plus years here at the University of Iowa, what changes over that time do you feel bring you the greatest satisfaction in knowing that the change agent in you had an impact here?
Well, first of all, I think, wow, that's a really important question. And like Liz, it's a hard one to answer. But, you know, I left at a time when I felt what I contributed, that somebody else needed to come and take it to a new level. And what I mean by that, the numbers had increased in terms of students. You know, there were cultural centers in place, a lot of support programs. The university was rethinking equity and diversity in ways that it just wasn't about numbers, but it also was about the climate, it was about support, etc. But as a student, the thing that stands out for me the very most and is when the few students of color came together and we had a conference. I believe it was in 1973. I can't remember the exact date, but and it was a Chicano native focused conference that brought over 3,000 Chicanos from all over the United States to our campus. And I think it made an important statement about diversity and the importance, etc. And that we were not an invisible population, but that we were an important population. And so, I mean, there's just numerous things that I could speak to in terms of what made me proud, but I did not do everything alone. If Tony Savala hadn't reached out to me and said, you've got to do this because you're our graduate student, you have to be our leader because you're the elder here, probably I would have taken a different path. But there were a lot of good people. And what's really wonderful for me is to know that all of them are out there as doctors and lawyers, as teachers and engineers, doing incredible work. And they all speak to their beginnings here at the University of Iowa, if you will. And even to this day, I receive notes from students of color, from women, etc., the LGBT community, etc., talking about how Iowa made a difference in their lives.
That's very gratifying to hear. And again, Dr. Barcelo, thank you so much for your insights and for your perspective today. You mentioned the conference. It was in 1973, and we do have some records of that in our LNAC collection in the University Archives, the Latino Native American Cultural Center. And the foundation for that was laid largely by people like you. And on this day, we express our gratitude to you and those who worked with you during that formative time. Thank you again, Dr. Barcelo, for joining us. And keep warm in Santa Fe. I understand there will be some snow on the way, so batten down the hatches.
Thank you.
Our next guest is Dean Sarah Sanders, who was appointed as the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences in 2021, and also serves as its Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. As a professor of social work, Dean Sanders joined the University of Iowa faculty in 2003 And we're delighted, Dr. Sanders, to have your perspective this afternoon on the academy of the university and what it means for us, not only in the late 19th century, but also today. We're looking forward to your remarks. So over to you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. And I just really want to thank both Liz and Dr. Barcelo for their comments. Liz, my children went to the museum for years, and so it was wonderful to hear your comments. So before I speak, I just want to give reference to this book because, like Dr. Barcelo, I am not a historian. I'm a faculty member who believes that we learn so much from looking at where we've been to where we're going. So this is a book that I used to prepare for this presentation that's really looking at the history and the pictures of the University of Iowa. And as I think about my presentation, I want us to think about where do we want to see ourselves going in the future? So the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences was actually established way back in the early time of the 1900s. What is fascinating when we think about the roots of the university, we were the university, we were the college in many respects. And so when we think about what does it mean to educate broadly, that is what we did. We educated broadly from the arts to the sciences, to literature, to social sciences, from really day one. So what I think is fascinating is that there has been a natural tension at the University of Iowa from dating way back into the 1800s between what we call the classical and the practical. And what I really like about this is I'm a practical person. So as David indicated, I come from the School of Social Work. I'm a practice discipline. So this philosophy on what should the University of Iowa be? Should we be a classical education program? Or should we engage in this practical side of education? Really stems back to that early time when we were just originating. And the question that people asked during this time was, is the University of Iowa here to serve the cause of learning and stress ancient languages and literatures and abstract reasoning? Or are we really here to serve the needs of the community and the state? And what does it mean to be an institution that almost has like a dual mission, right? The classical and the practical. So when we think back to the origins of the University of Iowa, the answer to that question is actually yes. We are there to serve both purposes then, and we are there to serve both purposes now. So when we go back and think about when we were started as an institution, one of the things that we that we can look at is what the legislature and what the governor called for. And back in the late 1800s, what they were calling for is that we should be here as an institution to prepare Iowa for the next generation of teachers and doctors and lawyers. Well, what's fascinating about that, to go to the classical side, is that we are also bringing in faculty, we are bringing in researchers, we are bringing in people who are actually rooted in the deep, deep core of a liberal arts education. And many of these individuals are actually coming from East Coast colleges. So they were bringing in the philosophy and the orientation of liberal arts right in. So when you look to our past and you look at some of our very first areas of study, you'll see areas such as Greek and Latin and mathematics and psychology and religious studies, and many of the programs that still exist today, because that focus on the classical was so, so important. But we never lost sight of the practical and what does it mean to serve the state and to help the state grow and nurture that next generation of professionals. So the early origins of the University of Iowa was really developed into 3 departments. I want to talk about those 3 departments because I think that they're really fascinating to consider. So the first area was really around a focus on preparing students for college. So I'm going to go back to this book, which I think is so phenomenal. They actually talk about in the book how the city of Iowa City at one point became so frustrated with the university that they said, fine, you all can teach the high school students. That's not a problem. Well, there was immediately a lot of pushback and said, no, we can't do that. So they changed it. But because of the few number of students who are actually college bound and eligible, the university played a really important role. And they actually talk about in the early history that if students could read and had some basic penmanship, and I love that word, basic penmanship, they were brought in to start that process of learning in a university type of setting. So that was actually one of the initial areas of focus of the university. The second one was on really preparing teachers. And I think that goes back to, again, this debate that we have regarding the practical. We knew that as we grew as a state, we were going to need to have the teachers available to educate those future populations. The third area, though, is really where the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences comes into play. It is in that area where what was called the collegiate department was developed. And in the collegiate department, there was a focus on kind of the broader university, and it became the entity that provided undergraduate BA and BS degrees, which really now has become the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. So as we continue to think about the history of our college and of that college department that they used to call it, there was also a pendulum that swang back and forth as we think about that tension between classic and practical, between the sciences and between the literary. And we look at today who we are as a college, and we're rich in history of the sciences still, and that's part of where our future is heading. And we're also so strong in the literary, the writing, the communication. And that is now part of our history, but also the strategy and the strategic visioning where we're heading in the future. So I want to talk just a little bit about the science, because this pairs into what Liz said as well. So when we think about that science piece, one of the very early presidents, he brought in a very dynamic professor. It was actually President Spencer. He brought in a dynamic professor in the natural sciences named Gustavus Henrichs. And what's interesting is Professor Henrichs actually built the Iowa laboratory classes in physics and chemistry. And in fact, you can look at an Iowa Now article, and I bet David can provide this to us, that actually talked a little bit about Professor Henrichs' work. So one of the things that he did is that he was one of the pioneers in terms of building out the science arm of the institution, particularly again in physics and chemistry, and allowing students to really dig into that research side. He published in some of the top science journals. He actually developed an interest in meteorology. And what's fascinating about Professor Henrichs is he actually is the individual who coined the term derecho. And if for any of you who live in Iowa, you know back in 2020, we had a derecho. And he used that to describe the storms that he saw happening within Iowa. He seems like kind of a character. Again, when I started to study him, he seems like he was kind of a character for how he really tried to push the institution in terms of this whole basis of scientific inquiry. And I don't have time to get much more into it today, but I just wanted to make mention of that. This also pairs in with Liz's work around the expeditions. And I can't say enough about how those expeditions became a really important part of the scientific inquiry and learning that happened within the University of Iowa. So if you think about the fact that we, as an institution, were sending students out on boats in the late 1800s to go to the Bahamas, or they were going to the Rocky Mountains, or they were going to the Arctic and bringing back these artifacts to study, that really paved the way for us being one of the most dynamic science areas in the Big Ten. And we can see that through even our space physics program now, that inquiry, that curiosity for beyond is so significant. So at the same time that we were having this really interesting history with science, we also were really developing this place at the University of Iowa in the late 1800s around humanities and around literature. So when we think about ourselves as being the writing university, we have to look back to where did that really come from? And what's fascinating is during this early time, one of the top extracurricular activities, this is before sports, this is before a lot of those things started to happen, they had what was called literary organizations or literary societies. That was a technical term, literary societies. And these were student organizations that actually existed beyond the classroom. And they were a place where students could gather together to sharpen their literary and their rhetorical skills. And so as I studied these and I looked at what these literary societies and what was the meat and potatoes of them, What was fascinating in these societies is that this is where students would debate interesting topics. So in my mind, it could be a situation in which they debate the role of women in higher ed, for instance, or they maybe would take a book, one of the classic books, and they would debate the content and how does it apply to the current time or to the issues that they were facing as a university student. It was during those times of the literary society that we really started to see the foundation of the University of Iowa to being a great writing institution start to be formed, and where we started to see that tradition in debate and in discussion and in critical thinking become even at the more forefront. So again, if we loop back to where we were early on in terms of the development of a classical education, these literary societies played a really important role in that. So as we start to think about the Writing University, the first course was actually called Verse Making, and it was offered in 1893. That was 45 years before the Writers' Workshop ever occurred. So when you think about this half century, the first half century of the university's existence, you can see how these two prongs, classical and practical, and science and writing or literary inquiry became such a forefront. So now as we start to speed forward, we often think about the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences as being the heart of the university. Well, actually, we're the foundation of the university. It was through us that the university formed around us. And you'll be able to see these historic strengths in exactly what we are doing today. So as we think about competing nationally for students, for faculty and research, all those same areas of excellence that we built ourselves on still are present in terms of what is driving our reputation now. So today, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences is really at the center of the University of Iowa experience. What do we provide? We provide the Class Core, which is the general education program that impacts every undergraduate that comes through, which again is fascinating as we think back to those early classes that these students took. When we think about the history of the college, we have to remember that we are still living on the shoulders of our predecessors, right? We're still building up that reputation in terms of really being custodians of this institution. And as the dean of the college today, I oftentimes will say to my faculty, I get emotional. I will get choked up walking across campus and remembering that I'm walking in the footsteps of some of the great people who found the place that I love so much. I always think back to my grandfather who went to law school in 1932 here in Gilmore Hall. I walk in those footsteps and I'm a custodian of this great institution. So just a couple of things I'll say in closing is that a lot of people will say, you know, classical versus practical. Parents will say this to me. Why should my kid get a liberal arts education? I'm a mom of a Hawkeye. I have a sophomore here and I have three other kids who maybe are going to be Hawkeye someday. Why a college degree? Why a liberal arts education? And what I think that we have to remember is that history. Our history indicated to us that the skills of thinking, communication, analyzing, problem solving, debate, those are all part of who we are. And those same values exist today, regardless if you're going to be a social worker like me, if you're going to be a mathematician, or if you're going to be a space physicist. That core of a liberal arts education is absolutely central. And so just in closing, I'll say just a few things before I turn it back over to David. As we look to the future and as we think about where we're heading with higher ed, I would encourage us all to remember, what do we value? What do we emphasize? And how do we continue to bridge these classical practical ideas as we shape the next generation of students, which is where I'm particularly passionate about. So thank you so much. And again, thank you to Dr. Barcelo and Liz for your wonderful remarks and how they all built together so nicely.
Dean Sanders, thank you so much for your remarks, and they really put into perspective, I think, the continuing relevance of a liberal education. And I really like the fact that you brought up the classical practical dichotomy. And I don't think that it necessarily has to be a dichotomy. We can have both. And I believe that that's what education is really all about in terms of making us better citizens. And I really am very appreciative of your remarks for that. Thank you very much for joining our panel. We do have a few questions for all three members of our panel, so I'll get to that in just a moment. But I wanted to mention, following up, Dean Sanders, the book that you recommended. I'll be pleased to amplify a bit. That's John Gerber's um, masterpiece called A Pictorial History of the University of Iowa. And it's not just a coffee table book. There are, to be sure, some wonderful photographs from various collections in the archives that Dr. Gerber had researched. But the narrative that he prepares, I think, really outlines the history of the academy here. So it's not, despite the title, it's not merely a pictorial history, but I think it really is a very good historical narrative. I believe there are still copies in print. I know that the original edition, I think around 1988, was updated sometime after 2005, and that was published by the University of Iowa Press, if anyone is interested. It's called A Pictorial History of the University of Iowa, and the author is John Gerber, who for a number of years was chair of the Department of English here. While I'm on the topic of books, and then I'll get to the questions, I would like to recommend another book that I think chronicles mainly the 20th century of the University of Iowa, as its title implies, but there is a good foundational chapter early on in the book, and that is a book entitled The University of Iowa in the 20th Century. And the author of that work is Stowe Persons. Dr. Persons was a professor, longtime professor of history here. Uh, Came here, I believe, around 1949 or so, when the Department of History was undergoing significant change in the way that historiography was being articulated in the profession. And he was very much a part of that new, at the time, generation of scholars in the mid-20th century who assess and evaluate historical resources in ways that had not been conducted before. So his work is another title that I would recommend. The University of Iowa in the 20th Century, and again, the author, Stowe Persons. And both of those titles were published by the University of Iowa Press. So with that, I'll get to questions here, and I would like to invite all three of our panelists to come back up, and I will ask, well, let's see here. I'm scrolling through and asking really particularly for Liz and Rusty. We'll start with you both. Is there a faculty or staff member who had the greatest influence on your experience at the University of Iowa? And either of you can take that question first.
I'd be happy to respond. Quite frankly, I was going to leave I was in the School of Social Work, Sarah, and I was feeling really alone, and I was going to drop out of school. And when I was on my way to the registrar's office, there was a brochure on the floor. I instinctively picked it up to throw it in the garbage, and it talked about an EOP, an Educational Opportunity Program. And I opened it, it was about minority students, so for whatever reason, I followed it into this office, and there was Phil Jones. He was the director of the program. I never had heard of him, with his feet up on his desk. And I asked him if this was the minority program. And his first response to me, he said, "Yeah, what minority are you?" And when I said, "Well, is it okay if I'm a Chicana?" he jumps out of his seat. Anyway, to make a long story short, he told me I couldn't leave. And it was probably the best advice I ever received. And I stayed at Iowa for many reasons. And he helped me find additional financial support to stay, etc. But he had a great influence on my life.
That's wonderful. Philip Jones was Dean of Students, as I recall, and was, I believe, the first African-American administrator to hold that position in the Big Ten, and was appointed by or named by President Boyd. A remarkable individual, and that's a wonderful story, Dr. Barcelo. Thank you. Liz, your turn if you'd like to respond.
We also have a connection to Phil Jones. At one point, believe it or not, the museums reported to the Dean of Students. And so for a brief time, we reported to him. So it's really it feels like a big campus sometimes, but it's really not, you know. Uh, I had a number of people who were really instrumental in getting me to where I am now. Um, some of them were instructors. Um, I always knew that I wanted, well, I didn't, that's not true. I didn't always know that I wanted to work in museums. I didn't know that I could do that until I was well into my adulthood. And I thought, hey, I can take these administrative skills that I have and my love for museums and I can combine them. And there was a faculty member in the Department of History, Ken Camille, who was the director at the Center for Human Rights. I spent part of my university career there. That was really wonderful. Ken was our director. Ken, unbeknownst to me, was also the director of the Museum Studies Certificate Program. And I said to him one day, because I was still pecking away at my undergraduate degree, I took a slower track. I said, Ken, I didn't know that this thing existed on campus, and you're the director. How can I not know that? And he laughed. He had a wonderful laugh, and he laughed this big laugh, and he said, "That albatross around my neck." And you know, the whole allegory with the albatross and where I am today, and the cyclorama, and his role in helping me achieve that is really something. So Ken Camille is someone that I credit a lot of this to. Another person is Sandy Boyd. I went to talk to him one day, and I don't know if anyone has had the privilege to have been in his office in the College of Law, but it was stacked to the ceilings with articles and clippings and all sorts of things to be read. And uh, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I wanted to pursue a master's in museum studies. I didn't know if I wanted to go into public administration. I didn't know if I wanted to go into development and fundraising. And I had this brief conversation, 15 minutes with him, and really helped me solidify what it was and where I wanted to be. So those two individuals were people on campus who were really instrumental for me.
Thank you, Liz. They're both remarkable guideposts, and I love hearing any story that has anything to do with Sandy Boyd. What a gentleman. Next question for Rusty. I think you may have addressed it, but if not, um, I'll bring this up again. You mentioned in your prepared remarks that you were not planning to do this work. What was your plan initially when you came to Iowa for graduate school?
I initially wanted to be a play therapist with that's why I have a master's degree in recreation education. I thought I should learn something about play, but the School of Social Work actually admitted me 3 weeks before classes began and offered me a full scholarship, etc. So I came here to be a social worker doing play therapy with children was my goal. Um, I will say that the education that I received in social work at my undergraduate school as well as Iowa really has served me well through the years. I will say that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Question for Sarah. The College of Liberal Arts and Sciences is the largest college at Iowa still today. What are the largest majors now, the most popular majors within the college?
Yep. So I would say when we look across the college, we have several large hubs. And so you can look at health and human physiology. Health and human physiology is broken into a variety of areas. And that entire body has over 2,000 students. And so that is a quickly growing area. And I think that through the leadership that has been provided in sports and rec management, that has become a predominantly strong destination type of program. We can also look over to PBS, so psychological and brain sciences. a large number of students. And don't quote me on this, but it's well over 1,000 students. And so I think that's another area that a lot of students see themselves going into, really studying the way people think and the way that we deal with emotions, et cetera. And so they end up going in there. But across the college, when we think about popular majors, I think that we can look at them in terms of size, but we also have areas that are very selective because of the types of training that they give students and the type of skills that those students are developing. And so they may be smaller areas, but they're also very targeted towards what the students are doing as well.
Thank you, Dean Sanders. A question for you, Liz. I was wondering if somebody was going to ask about our friend Rusty the Sloth. Arguably, one of the most famous exhibits in the museum is Rusty, and someone wants to know, including me, how did Rusty make his way to Iowa?
That's a great question. And Rusty, we would say, and I've heard orientation tour guides echo this, so I think it must be true. Rusty is the unofficial mascot of the university. So we're really happy that he's here with us. Rusty is an example of megafauna that used to roam the state of Iowa, particularly the southern half of the state during the Ice Age, the last Ice Age. And so while we don't have, well, I'll share this with you, but it may ruin a little bit of your Rusty magic. Rusty is really made of styrofoam. He's layers and layers of styrofoam stacked together and carved, like they carve a cake on Cake Boss or those big cake competition shows. He's carved into a sloth shape, and then his fur is made of over 2,000 cow tails that were purchased from the Chicago stockyards and dyed with henna to achieve the same hue. But we know what Rusty looked like because we've uncovered many, many sloth fossils and remnants in the lower half of our state. So predominantly a sloth family was uncovered a few years ago, the Tarkio Valley sloth exploration. It's the first time that a sloth family was found. So the first time that we have evidence that they lived in family units. And sadly, sloths did not succumb, as some people think, to further cooling of the environment, but rather they were big and slow and very tasty, and were probably hunted to extinction.
Okay. Thank you, Liz. I need to make a correction, and I want to thank one of our participants, Mike Boyd, for pointing this out. I misspoke. Actually, Philip Hubbard was appointed Dean of Students by President Boyd around 1970, I believe. And Philip Jones, at a later point, assumed that position. So thank you for correcting on that, Mike. I'm looking at a couple of other questions here. Liz, confirm for me if you could, is George Schremper still in Iowa City? I know he retired at some point, maybe about 15 years ago.
Oh, I muted. He did retire a number of years ago, but he does, I still believe, spend some time in Iowa City. He also splits its time between Iowa City and Northeast Iowa, pardon me.
Okay,
But yes,
Yep.
he's still around. You still run into him every once in a while. I'll catch him in the museum.
A great legacy. Thank you for updating us about him. Question from one of our participants, and I believe this is directed to Dr. Barcelo. Having you on my doctoral dissertation committee in the early 1980s, I know you worked on many important projects. Did you face much discrimination in your working capacity at the University of Iowa in the 1970s and 80s? Oh, I believe you're muted, Dr. Barcelo. Sorry. There you go.
That's a real difficult question, and it's a painful question also. Um, Definitely, I'll just say this, when I was pursuing my dissertation, I had a hard time because it was about justifying why I, as a Chicana, was doing a study about Chicanos. And I would raise the question, well, why can you do a study about your population? And so those were those kinds of conversations. I certainly, around my sexuality, there was a little bit more response to me because it raised other issues. I wasn't your typical Chicana, let me put it that way. And that was unfortunate. But what I will say about some of the, I was prepared for some of these issues and concerns, given my how I was raised in the military and all the stuff that we experienced as a family. Um, but I tried not to let it drive me, let me put it that way. Although I was prepared to leave the University of Iowa because of the isolation that I felt. But in terms of some direct things that happened to me, I would say no, there were some things that certainly happened that led me to leave the University of Iowa, quite frankly, to the University of Minnesota. But it was probably time for me to go. I thought everybody loved me, but I soon learned that that was not the case. And so I was more engaged with things that were happening to students and how we resolved them. What happened to a dental student, for example. Those kinds of things just really hit home. And because of how I look, I think it was difficult for people to see me as a person of color. I sort of walked that in between space, if you will. Some people would say I had white privilege, etc. And I was very aware of that, and I used it to my advantage and to the advantage of the work that I was doing, quite frankly. This work is about building relationships. And I want to believe that when people make inappropriate statements, they do it not always intentional, but if you do it 3 times, then I say that it would be intentional. And so I tried to work on that. So I don't know that I could answer the question directly. I sure would like to know who the student is that the dissertation that I sat on. I hope I didn't give you too hard a time.
If I may, and his name does appear here, Jeff Stevenson.
Oh my God, Jeff. Yes, yes, he knows some of the stories. That's why he asked the question. Hi, Jeff. Good to see you.
I'm so glad that, as difficult a question as it is, I'm glad that one of your uh, uh, colleagues, one of your students had raised that question, and it, as difficult as it is, it's also important to be addressed. And thank you so much, Dr. Barcelo. Well, here's a question I guess I'll take on. A person wants to know, um, well, in reference to Liz talking about the many birds in our museum, and made this inquirer wonder about our Hawkeye mascot. Do you know how we got the Hawkeye mascot? And Liz, don't worry about answering that. I'll take a crack at it. Herky the Hawkeye, just Herky the Hawk rather, just turned 75 a couple of years ago. Herky was the creation of Dick Spencer. Dick was believed to be, this may yet be another University of Iowa first, the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Iowa was the first in the nation to offer a course in editorial cartooning. And Dick Spencer was the lead lecturer of that class in 1948 when he proposed the idea of a cartoon-like character to represent the Hawkeyes. By that time, we already had Bucky Badger at the University of Wisconsin, Goldie the Gopher at the University of Minnesota, and so forth. I think they, in Dick's estimation, Iowa needed an equivalent, and so he created Herky in 1948. Now, the name Herky came from another individual whose name escapes me. I remember he was from Belle Plaine. He took part in a contest and submitted the name Herky, short for Hercules. And that one-two punch, the character development for the football game programs and promotional materials, and the name Herky both were devised in 1948. So there you have it. That's how we have our mascot today. Before we close out, I just want to check to make sure I haven't overlooked any questions. I do want to give a shout out to Wayne Svoboda. Wayne, I don't know if you're still on the line, but thank you for asking about the picture book citation. Um, uh, Wayne and I both attended that other university at Ames, which I hope I don't shatter any illusions or any such. Another perfectly esteemed institution. We both studied journalism, and I remember you, Wayne. I hope we can get in touch again soon. It would be great to catch up with you and see how you're doing. So I have a final question as time wraps up here. We have about 5 minutes left for all three of you. We've talked about Iowa's early history tonight. What are you all most excited for in the future of Iowa?
I can go. So when I think about the future of Iowa, I think about the contributions that we can make to the larger world around us through the education of students. And I'm going to lean in again to the fact that I'm a parent, and oftentimes people will say to me, "Do you want your kids to go to University of Iowa?" And or how do you feel that your daughter's at University of Iowa? And I always say, I can stand behind the education and the experiences and the opportunities and the hands-on learning that these students get. And so when I look at the students who we are training, they're going to be the future leaders in society. They're going to be the ones who are out there addressing climate change, and they're going to be out there the ones who are teaching next generations of students, and they're going to be out there the ones who are making new scientific advances, whatever it may be. And that excites me because as I look about my 20-year career here, I can see these difference makers throughout the country, and they all carry the brand of being a Hawkeye. And for that, I'm incredibly proud, and I'm excited to watch that next generation start to turn out.
You know,
I
if
can, oh, go ahead, Rusty.
All
Oh,
right.
I'll go next. And I work on a university campus in a university museum because I love being on this campus. Love being a liaison between our community and our institution. And every day I get to work with our students is exciting. And when I get to do that, I learn more from them, I think, than they probably learn from me. Don't tell them that, but uh, it's really invigorating, and that's why I'm here. And so I really echo what Dean Sanders is saying. The resiliency that I have seen on this campus in the recent times, and the things that our current cohort of students are taking with them and their experience and what it means for our future is real. It's corny, but I get a little goosebumpy just thinking about it. We have some really incredible students on our campus, and I'm proud to be a small part of their educational experience.
if I could just add, one of the things I've seen in the last year that gives me great hope for the University of Iowa, I'm sorry, those are my dogs, is that, and I'm not going to say this just because Dean Sanders is on the panel, but the thing that has been really been very positive for me to see is the role that deans are playing on behalf of equity and diversity at the university. And I think that's real critical versus just seeing it as the responsibility of a single office. And also the fact that Dr. Tovar reports directly to the president, I think is really an important statement about this work. And what it is, it's a comprehensive approach to the work in that it's everyone's responsibility. And that's what I've really seen as one of the major changes, having been working with the university this past year, which means it'll impact the broader community in the end. And I think that that's really very, very important. It'll be even a more welcoming place. And again, I'm just really impressed with what the university is trying to do in light of some of the issues and challenges that we're facing today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barcelo. And with that, let me first of all thank our three featured guests for this afternoon. I've learned a lot. I hope you all have as well about Iowa's history and the opportunities before us. I'm sure our attendees enjoyed this as well. Let me also thank our guests who joined us tonight. We had anywhere from 75 to 200 people dropping in and out, and it was a wonderful turnout today, and we appreciate all of you taking part today. The session would not have been possible without your support. Thanks also to those who provided us with technical and editorial support. Heather Walensky, Nikki Bontrager, Tony Hakes, Derek Harrigan, and Ben Hill for their support. You all made my job so much easier. I really, really do appreciate it. Tonight's recording will be uploaded to the University of Iowa Center for Advancement's YouTube page next week in case you would like to share it with your friends. You can find that channel by going into YouTube and entering the term University of Iowa Center for Advancement. Also check the chat line for the URL and other information about that as well. If you enjoyed tonight's session, you can register to join us next week too, as we talk about 3 areas of distinction for the University of Iowa that were all established in the early part of the 20th century. We'll be joined by Lan Samantha Chang, an Iowa alumnus and director of the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is, of course, the leading creative writing program in the country. We'll also be joined by Quinn Early, a 1987 alumnus and pro football player who now spends his days working as a stunt double and his nights as a screenwriter. Quinn recently created an award-winning documentary about Frank Kinney Holbrook, who was the first Black football player to attend the University of Iowa in 1895. And next week, we will also be welcoming Patricia Winokur, an Iowa alumna, professor of internal medicine and infectious diseases, and executive dean of the Carver College of Medicine to speak about the University of Iowa's hospitals and clinics. Those of you who registered to attend will receive some advanced readings from our speakers on Friday of this week, coming up in a couple of days. And you are welcome to send your questions in advance to Heather Walensky as well. Thank you all very much again for joining us tonight. Thank you for your support of the University of Iowa. And as we all know, once a Hawkeye, always a Hawkeye. I'm David McCartney, University of Iowa archivist. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.